Hey, it's Jackie here from the Early Years Learning Hub. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know about our subscription option. If you're a fan of our podcasts and would like to see us continue to bring you interesting speakers on all of the topics you didn't even know you needed to hear about, as well as accessing some really great resources to help you put some of the ideas from the podcast into practice, then why not subscribe? It is great value at just $2.99 plus GST per month and is automatically debited from your bank account. Simply go to our website, Early Years Learning Hub, and click on the subscribe button. Welcome to another episode of the Early Years Learning Hub podcast series titled Professional Learning Tapas, where I share what I hope are some golden gems of learning that inspire you to make some changes into your practice that work for you and, most importantly, help the children and families that you work with to thrive. So this week's topic is inspired by a professional learning workshop that I just facilitated today for a local network group, and that is all about evidence-based transition to school practices. And you might be thinking, Jackie, we don't have to worry about that until the end of the year. Well, hopefully I'll convince you with today's podcast that it's actually something we need to be thinking about all year round if we're going to offer a really comprehensive, inclusive, differentiated transition for children and families, particularly our vulnerable families. So we started the session, as I do when I acknowledge I share a resource that I think is relevant, and I shared the SNAKE transition to school guide. And in there, it starts off with, I think, a very poignant reminder that children and families' first experience with school has significant implications for both their educational and broader development outcomes. And that is even more accentuated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children due to lower enrolment rates and attendance at early childhood services. And that was definitely something that I was hearing, not just about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, but how much from the network today, how much further behind those children are if they haven't engaged with any form of a playgroup or an early childhood service. So just thinking about how we connect with some of those families as well. So some of the other groups that I wanted to share with you as well, because you know, there's actually, I guess, a need to be thinking quite deeply across a lot of children who may fit into one of these categories or may experience a range of these all together at the same time. So this is sharing some research done by Dr. Catherine Hops, or led by Dr. Catherine Hops, and talking about some groups that might experience greater vulnerability. And they include children and or families, so it could be both, with a disability or developmental delay. I feel like that one is a little bit more obvious, but again, what are you doing specifically, differently and differentiated for those groups? Children or families with a chronic, short or long-term physical or mental health issue or condition that's going to impact, a range of different things, from even, a parent's ability to be able to get their child to go to preschool or daycare or early learning, It could be children or families from culturally or linguistically diverse backgrounds, because there's obviously going to be a language barrier there. Children or families with refugee, migrant experiences or newly arrived families. So obviously a really different and possibly traumatic experience there. Perhaps living in refugee camps. Perhaps it's taken them a long time to get from their home country to Australia, and their children may have missed out on some important early childhood learning at that time. As we've mentioned already, children from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander backgrounds, children or families who've experienced trauma and adversity, low socioeconomic and parenting resources. So if that parent doesn't have a lot of parenting skills or parenting supports, all of that kind of stuff. This is an interesting one too, I think. Children with high potential or who are gifted. So, those children that are high performing, we often think of more of a deficit model when we think of vulnerabilities, but those children obviously are at risk if we don't share the information about their high potential or giftedness to schools, that they may disengage in those early years of school because they can already do a lot of stuff that they're being asked to do. And children or families with high mobility, including families from the Australian Defence Force. That's an interesting one too, to think about, we don't often always know that. I don't myself personally as a practitioner in early childhood, how many schools and services has this family or this child already attended. Again, that could have an impact. So interesting things to share there. And I have going to recommend some courses that we've got. We've got a whole transition to school catalogue. And one of the courses is we really unpack this in a lot of detail, or the evidence and the research around this. So if you're thinking that that might be something you're interested in, then I do recommend those courses, but they'll be in the links. And don't forget, you get a discount when you purchase. As a podcast listener, you just enter POD, POD 25 at the checkout. You get 25% off our courses. The next thing I always like to point out is some interesting ideas or practices or strategies that the OECD Starting Strong 5 report talked about when they talked about transitions between early childhood and primary, and looked at what different countries and what successful practices are internationally. And some of the things that were on their list were shared views between early childhood education and care and schools on transitioning. So that makes sense, doesn't it, that it's a priority for both groups, and, that they understand, I guess, the evidence. Each group understands the evidence behind why these practices are important. Alignment and balance between what and how children learn in early childhood and primary, so curriculum and pedagogical practices. One of our evidence-based transition practices course actually includes a curriculum links handout to help everybody to understand that, but also for schools, important to be implementing some play-based learning, particularly in those early stages of kindergarten. So there's a little bit of familiarity and continuity of learning and teaching in that space. Shared understandings on individual differences and how each child learns differently. So that understanding of, developmental ranges, but also learning styles, dispositions, and preferences. Practices between early childhood, primary teachers, such as sharing written information, transition to school statements, on child development and children's experiences. So that's really important. And we have a writing transition to school statements course. And in there, we talk about the emphasis of the importance of that being a starting point for conversations and alignment of pedagogical understanding of preschool and primary teachers through training. So that idea that you understand each other's spaces. So this is the learning and how it happens in early childhood in terms of the early years learning framework and approved learning frameworks. And this is the learning that happens at school in terms of the curriculum and the key learning areas. So it really goes to show that transition really is quite a big piece, and it goes way beyond one-off orientation programs, and requires really, if you want to do it well and you want to really work together to offer those wraparound supports for everyone, but particularly those vulnerable groups that we talked about, it really requires early childhood services, school-age services, families, playgroups, allied health professionals, community groups, support groups that work with vulnerable families, and schools to all work together to partner, collaborate, and plan for year-round transition practices. So obviously we're nearly halfway through the year, so maybe you start now and get onto some things well before it's sort of transition to school statement time, orientation time. You start connecting and sharing information with families' permission about some families and children that might need some extra support. Really important that you let schools know as early as possible if children have a disability or additional needs, particularly physical needs, so the school can get the wheels in motion to make the arrangements that they need to, for example, a ramp. And an even better idea is the idea of creating a transition network that provides those wraparound supports that we talked about for vulnerable children and families that they need so much. And some of the stories I heard today with some amazing work that these teachers and educators were doing were things like very basic help, which is so important because if you don't have the basics, you can't even start. So help with families, helping families filling in forms, getting birth certificates, to right through to the other end of the spectrum where they support families once their child has actually started school to advocate for their child because their child wasn't settling in well. So again, you can see how those connections and those partnerships and those secure, respectful relationships are so important with your key stakeholders. Particularly, all of those are equally important, but I think that connection between early childhood and school is pivotal And the sharing of information, accessing of information through the transition to school statement is really important. So I know that when I say these things, you're probably all going like we all do now. If only I had the time. It is time consuming, but I do think one of the benefits of having a transition to school network is that you can focus in on creating a plan for how you work together and divvying up the jobs and sharing the load. So everybody, instead of everyone, connecting and reaching out, you actually can, bring people in. So you can bring those allied health professionals in that, you can access those shared resources and things like that. And it is worth noting that in both spaces, it is actually a policy requirement. So in Education and Care Services, Quality Area 6, we're required to focusing in on supporting children and families through transition. And in New South Wales, at least, it's also a part of the School Excellence Framework and the learning domain that transitions and continuity of learning is supported. But there's engagement with communities and families are key partners. So we're actually required to focus in on that anyway. And also it's a great way, if you're doing this, it's a great way to demonstrate some really meaningful engagement with your community, which of course is one of the exceeding themes. So I hope that what I have given you is a bit of a taster and a bit of a motivator to learn more and reflect on what you're doing now in relation to transition space, and also looking at connecting and networking with your community. What are your groups now? Who needs some differentiated transition support and how can you achieve that? And again, start small. Start with one step, one connection, one connection a week or whatever it might be, and slowly get the momentum will start and you will start reaching out to those. So some related resources, as I said, if you'd like to know more, we've got our whole catalogue range. There's 3 courses altogether, one on partnerships, one on transition statements, and one on the evidence-based transition practices that I'm talking a bit about today. Also, you might want to think about becoming a member and being supported if you need some mentoring and coaching around this area and how you might go about that. And that's one of the perks of being a member. So thank you for your time. As I said, don't forget to subscribe or follow us, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and rate our podcast. We'd love to hear what you think. Add some comments if you've got any questions or any ideas for future episodes. Thanks again.